Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absolutely revolting world of medieval sleep habits, and trust me, you're about to discover why your worst camping experience was basically a 5-star hotel, compared to how people caught their Z's in the Middle Ages. Picture this. You're settling into your straw mattress, and I use the term mattress very loosely here as something with 6 legs scurries across your face. You brush it away, only to feel another creature, then another, until you realize your bed isn't just a place to sleep, it's a thriving ecosystem of insects, rodents, and parasites that have claimed squatters' rights to your body heat. You probably won't survive 5 minutes in a medieval bedroom without questioning every life choice that led humanity to this point, but somehow our ancestors managed to get through entire nights in these conditions. The sheer audacity of medieval people calling these pest-infested hay piles comfortable would be impressive if it weren't so horrifying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this little community spans the globe, all united in our collective gratitude for modern pest control and actual mattresses. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slide onto your medieval straw mattress, and immediately you understand why the wealthy considered a good night's sleep the ultimate luxury. The straw beneath you isn't the golden, clean wheat stalks you might imagine from pastoral paintings. No, this straw has been recycled, reused, and inhabited by countless creatures for months, maybe years. It's damp in places from mysterious sources you'd rather not contemplate, and it crackles with every movement, like a campfire made of whispers and regret. The fleas are the first to greet you. Medieval beds were basically flea condominiums, and these tiny vampires had perfected the art of nocturnal harassment. They'd feast on you throughout the night, leaving you covered in itchy welts that would make you look like you'd been through a medieval version of paintball, except the paint was your own blood, and the game never ended. People became so accustomed to flea bites that they developed elaborate scratching techniques, treating their nighttime contortions like a bizarre form of yoga. But fleas were just the opening act. Bedbugs had claimed the headliner spot in this nightly horror show. These flat brown nightmares would emerge from the straw and wooden bed frames like tiny, blood-sucking ninjas. They'd crawl across your skin with the confidence of rent-paying tenants, which in a way they were. Medieval people knew about bedbugs. They called them wall lice or mahogany flats, and developed some truly creative, if ineffective, methods for dealing with them. The most popular bedbug remedy involved placing the legs of your bed in bowls of water, creating a makeshift moat. The theory was sound. Bedbugs couldn't swim, so they'd be trapped. The reality was messier. Bedbugs, it turns out, are excellent climbers, and could easily scale the walls and drop down onto sleeping victims from above, like some kind of medieval mission. Impossible scenario, except Tom Cruise was a blood-sucking parasite, and the mission was always successful. Lice were the third member of this unholy trinity of sleep disruption. Head lice, body lice, and pubic lice each had their preferred territories, and they defended them with the determination of medieval knights protecting their kingdoms. Body lice, in particular, were so common that they were considered a sign of normal human existence. People would spend their evenings in what they called lousing, systematically hunting through each other's hair and clothing to remove these unwanted passengers. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually slept better than we do today, given their acceptance of these conditions. Some scholars suggest that the constant low-level discomfort from parasites created a kind of sleep exhaustion that made people pass out more completely once they finally succumbed to unconsciousness. Others argue that the chronic irritation led to lighter, more fragmented sleep patterns that made people perpetually tired and cranky. The straw itself harbored more than just insects. Mice and rats considered medieval bedding prime real estate, creating elaborate tunnel systems through the straw like tiny underground cities. You'd often wake up to find mouse droppings scattered across your sleeping area, or worse, discover that a family of rodents had established a nursery in the straw beneath your feet. The rustling sounds weren't just the straw settling, they were the soundtrack of dozens of small creatures going about their nocturnal business inches from your face. People developed interesting psychological adaptations to these conditions. They'd create elaborate bedtime rituals involving shaking out the straw, checking for larger intruders, and sometimes even singing or humming to mask the sounds of their unwanted bedmates. Some medieval texts describe people having conversations with their fleas, treating them like unwelcome but permanent roommates who at least had the decency to be quiet during the day. The wealthy, of course, had slightly better options. They could afford to replace their straw more frequently, and some even had access to feather mattresses, though these came with their own set of problems. Feathers harbored different types of parasites, and the down would often become matted and lumpy, creating a landscape of uncomfortable hills and valleys that made finding a comfortable sleeping position an exercise in advanced geometry. You wake up from your flea-infested slumber, only to realize you're not alone in your medieval bedand. We're not talking about the insects this time. You're sharing your sleeping space with your spouse, 3 children, 2 servants, a visiting merchant, and possibly a chicken that wandered in from the courtyard. Welcome to the medieval concept of privacy, which was about as common as a unicorn and twice as mythical. The idea of having your own bedroom was so foreign to medieval people that they didn't even have a word for it. What we call privacy, they called suspicious behavior, and what we call personal space, they called wasted real estate. You're lying in what's essentially a medieval slumber party that never ends, except instead of gossiping about crushes and painting each other's nails, you're listening to Uncle Gerald's earth-shaking snores and trying to avoid the sharp elbow of the blacksmith's apprentice who somehow ended up next to you. Medieval houses were designed with communal living in mind, which sounds lovely and community-oriented, until you realize it means you haven't had a moment alone in approximately 7 years. The Great Hall served as the central hub of medieval life, and when night fell, this same space transformed into a giant dormitory. Mattresses, sleeping mats, and piles of straw would be arranged across the floor like a medieval version of Tetris, except every piece was a human body, and the goal was to fit as many people as possible into the smallest space. The sleeping arrangements followed a strict social hierarchy that would make modern hotel loyalty programs look simple. The lord of the manor and his family claimed the few private chambers, which were still shared spaces but at least had walls and doors. The next tier, down-trusted servants, visiting dignitaries, and important guests might earn a spot in a smaller side chamber. Everyone else arranged themselves in the Great Hall according to their social standing, with the most important people closest to the fire and the least important people relegated to the drafty corners, where they could contemplate their life choices while slowly freezing to death. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even married couples didn't automatically get to sleep together. Medieval marriage was primarily a business arrangement, and the business didn't necessarily include exclusive sleeping rights. Wealthy men often maintained separate chambers from their wives, meeting up only for official reproductive duties and special occasions. Meanwhile, their wives shared their chambers with female servants, children, and sometimes other female relatives, creating what historians politely call female domestic spaces and what we'd call medieval sorority houses. The concept of children having their own beds was so revolutionary it wouldn't catch on for several more centuries. Kids were distributed among the adults like living hot water bottles, tucked in wherever there was space. Infants slept with their mothers, older children bunked with servants or relatives, and teenagers were basically treated like very small adults who could fend for themselves in the communal sleeping arrangement. The mortality rate for children was so high that investing in individual sleeping spaces probably seemed like counting chickens before they hatched if chickens had a 50% chance of not making it through the winter. Servants occupied the most precarious position in this sleeping ecosystem. They were expected to be available at all hours for their master's needs, which meant they often slept in the same rooms as their employers, ready to leap into action at a moment's notice. Kitchen servants slept near the kitchen, stable boys slept in the stables, and personal attendants slept on the floors of their master's chambers. It was like being a medieval on-call employee, except your workplace was also your bedroom, and your boss could literally wake you up by stepping on you. Historians still argue whether this communal sleeping arrangement was purely practical or served deeper social functions. Some scholars suggest that shared sleeping spaces reinforced social bonds and community ties, creating a kind of medieval team-building exercise that lasted 8 hours every night. Others argue that the lack of privacy was simply a result of limited resources and harsh living conditions, and that people would have preferred individual sleeping spaces if they could afford them. The logistics of getting everyone settled for the night were mind-boggling. Imagine trying to coordinate bedtime for 15 people of different ages, social ranks, and personal hygiene standards. There were unspoken rules about when you could lie down, where you could place your belongings, and how much space you were entitled to claim. Violating these rules could result in anything from dirty looks to actual physical altercations, because nothing brings out people's aggressive tendencies quite like sleep deprivation and territorial disputes. Personal belongings were stored in communal chests or hung from pegs on the walls, creating a medieval version of a shared closet. Finding your own possessions in the morning required the detective skills of Sherlock Holmes and the patience of a saint. People developed elaborate systems for marking their belongings and remembering where they'd placed them, though these systems often failed spectacularly when half-asleep servants rearranged everything while doing their pre-dawn chores. The most challenging aspect of communal sleeping was dealing with different sleep schedules and habits. Some people were natural early risers, others were night owls, and everyone had their own collection of sleep-disrupting behaviors. The snorers, the sleep talkers, the tossers and turners, and the people who apparently practiced medieval martial arts in their sleep all coexisted in the same space. It was like a medieval version of Survivor, except instead of voting people off the island, you just learned to sleep through their nocturnal shenanigans. Guests presented a special challenge to the communal sleeping system. Medieval hospitality required offering shelter to travelers, but this didn't mean providing them with private accommodations. Visiting merchants, pilgrims, and other strangers were integrated into the existing sleeping arrangement, often sharing space with people they'd never met before. It was the ultimate medieval icebreaker. "Hi, I'm traveling through town on business, and I'll be sleeping 6 inches from your face tonight." You've just drifted off to sleep in your communal medieval chamber when it starts a sound that could wake the dead, and probably has. Sir Roderick, the knight sleeping 3 feet away, begins producing a noise that sounds like a dragon with bronchitis, attempting to gargle gravel. His snoring isn't just loud, it's architectural, literally vibrating the wooden beams above your head and causing small pieces of thatch to rain down on your face like the world's most annoying snow globe. Welcome to the medieval snoring epidemic, a crisis so severe that it shaped social customs, sleeping arrangements, and probably contributed to more than a few mysterious deaths that were officially attributed to natural causes, but were really just cases of sleep-deprived people reaching their breaking point. You're about to discover that the Great Snoring Plague of the Middle Ages was a real phenomenon that historians have only recently begun to acknowledge, mainly because admitting that your scholarly research involves studying medieval nose-breathing patterns feels slightly ridiculous. Medieval people were champion snorers, and this wasn't just a coincidence. Their diet consisted largely of foods that would make modern nutritionists weep: heavily salted meats, fermented everything, and enough ale to float a small boat. This combination created the perfect storm for nasal congestion, sinus problems, and the kind of sleep apnea that could be heard 3 villages over. Add to this the fact that most people had never seen a toothbrush, and you've got a recipe for respiratory issues that would make a modern sleep clinic rich. The communal sleeping arrangements turned individual snoring problems into collective nightmares. When 15 people are sharing a single room, and 12 of them are producing sounds that range from gentle whistling to what can only be described as a medieval remix of industrial construction, sleep becomes less about rest and more about survival. People developed elaborate coping mechanisms that bordered on the supernatural. Some claimed they could predict the weather based on the pitch and intensity of their roommates' snoring patterns. Medieval literature is surprisingly full of references to snoring, though most scholars have dismissed these as comic relief rather than serious social commentary. The Canterbury Tales mentions travellers who snorted like pigs in summer heat, and various medieval poems describe the challenges of sleeping near thunder breathers and nose whistlers. What historians initially thought was just Chaucer being cheeky was actually documentary evidence of a widespread sleep crisis. The wealthy developed some creative solutions to the snoring problem. They began constructing sleeping chambers with thick walls and heavy tapestries, not just for warmth and privacy, but for sound dampening. Some medieval castles had rooms specifically designated for the loudest snorers, essentially creating medieval snoring quarantine zones. These rooms were often located in towers or separate buildings, far enough away that the snoring wouldn't disturb the rest of the household, but close enough that the snorers wouldn't freeze to death. But most people couldn't afford architectural solutions to their snoring problems, so they developed behavioral adaptations instead. Groups would designate snoring shifts, where the loudest snorers would be encouraged to fall asleep first, giving everyone else a chance to get settled before the noise began. Some communities even had informal snoring hierarchies. The person with the most thunderous snores got to sleep in the prime spot near the fire, while everyone else arranged themselves based on their tolerance for various types of nose music. Medieval medicine offered some truly bizarre remedies for snoring. Popular treatments included sleeping with garlic cloves stuffed up the nostrils, drinking wine mixed with crushed beetles, and wearing amulets made from the bones of particularly quiet animals. One medieval text recommends sleeping with a live eel wrapped around your neck, though it's unclear whether this was meant to cure snoring or just provide an alternative source of nighttime terror. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually slept less than we do today, or whether they just developed different expectations about sleep quality. Some evidence suggests that people accepted interrupted sleep as normal, viewing the ability to fall back asleep after being awakened as a valuable life skill. Others argue that chronic sleep deprivation from snoring-related disturbances contributed to the shorter lifespans and general crankiness that characterized medieval society. The snoring problem was so pervasive that it influenced medieval architecture in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The high, vaulted ceilings in medieval buildings weren't just for grandeur, they helped dissipate sound and prevent snoring echoes from bouncing around the room like acoustic ping-pong balls. Similarly, the practice of hanging heavy tapestries wasn't just decorative, it served as medieval sound insulation, though its effectiveness against industrial-strength snoring was limited. Women faced particular challenges in the snoring hierarchy. Medieval medical texts claimed that women snored less than men, which was probably true given that women's diets were often less rich, and their alcohol consumption was typically lower. However, this meant that women were expected to be more tolerant of men's snoring, since they were supposedly less likely to contribute to the problem themselves. Pregnant women, who actually do snore more due to hormonal changes, were often moved to separate spaces, though this was attributed to concerns about disturbing the unborn child rather than acknowledging that pregnancy-related snoring was a real phenomenon. The social implications of snoring were surprisingly complex. Loud snoring was sometimes viewed as a sign of good health and vitality, the theory being that only strong lungs could produce such powerful sounds. On the other hand, particularly obnoxious snoring could be grounds for social ostracism or even accusations of demonic possession. Some medieval texts describe snoring as a form of nighttime communication with evil spirits, though this was probably just people trying to make sense of sounds that seemed too horrible to be entirely human. Travel presented special challenges for medieval snorers. Inn accommodations were even more communal than home sleeping arrangements, often involving complete strangers sharing beds and floor space. Innkeepers developed reputations based partly on their ability to manage snoring guests, and some establishments charged extra fees for particularly loud sleepers. The phrase, snoring surcharge, appears in several medieval accounting records, suggesting that the problem was widespread enough to become a legitimate business consideration. You finally managed to doze off, despite Sir Roderick's earth-shaking snores when suddenly, clang, 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 the monastery bell tower erupts into a cacophony that would make a fire alarm seem like a gentle lullaby. It's midnight, which means it's time for matins, the first of several mandatory prayer sessions that will fragment your night into pieces smaller than the crumbs in your flea-infested straw mattress. Welcome to medieval sleep schedules, where the concept of 8 uninterrupted hours of rest was about as realistic as expecting your chamber pot to empty itself. The medieval church had divided the night into a series of prayer obligations that turned sleep into an elaborate game of spiritual hopscotch. You'd fall asleep around sunset, wake up at midnight for matins, try to fall back asleep, wake up again at 3 a.m. for lauds, doze fitfully until dawn, and then drag yourself through the day feeling like you'd been hit by a cart full of turnips. This wasn't just a monastic thing either. Lay people were expected to participate in these nocturnal prayer marathons, turning every night into a medieval version of a very religious, very exhausting camping trip. The practice of nocturnal prayer vigils wasn't just about spiritual devotion, it was rooted in biblical tradition and early Christian practices. Medieval theologians argued that the quiet hours of the night were when the soul was most receptive to divine communication, which sounds lovely until you realize they expected people to wake up multiple times every single night to test this theory. The biblical passage about praying without ceasing was interpreted quite literally, apparently without considering the long-term effects on people's mental health and basic cognitive function. Monasteries were the epicenter of this sleep disruption industry, with bells that could be heard for miles announcing each prayer session. These weren't gentle chimes designed to ease you into wakefulness, they were bronze behemoths that produced sounds capable of waking the dead, which was probably the point. Monks developed a kind of supernatural ability to wake up instantly at the sound of the bell, leap out of bed, and stumble through prayers while still half asleep, a skill that would be impressive if it weren't so utterly exhausting. But here's where it gets really interesting. People actually adapted to these fractured sleep schedules in ways that modern sleep scientists are only beginning to understand. Medieval texts describe something called first sleep and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between that was considered normal and even beneficial. During this middle-of-the-night wake period, people would pray, meditate, have conversations, engage in marital activities, or just lie quietly contemplating their lives, and probably wondering why they couldn't have been born in a century with better sleep hygiene. The wealthy had some advantages in managing these nocturnal prayer obligations. They could afford to maintain private chapels or hire chaplains to handle the religious duties on their behalf, though completely skipping night prayers was considered spiritually dangerous and socially scandalous. Some wealthy households developed elaborate systems involving servants who would wake up for prayers and then provide detailed reports about their spiritual experiences, essentially creating a medieval version of religious outsourcing. Historians still argue whether these fragmented sleep patterns were actually healthier than our modern expectation of continuous night sleep. Some research suggests that the medieval pattern of segmented sleep might have been more natural for human circadian rhythms, allowing for periods of quiet reflection and spiritual contemplation that our modern sleep schedules don't accommodate. Others argue that chronic sleep deprivation from constant nighttime interruptions contributed to the general irritability and shortened lifespans that characterized medieval society. The logistics of coordinating these nighttime prayer sessions were mind-boggling. In communal sleeping arrangements, someone had to be designated as the wake-up person, responsible for rousing everyone else when the bells rang. This was usually the most religious person in the group, or the person with the best hearing, or just the poor soul who had drawn the short straw. These midnight alarm clocks developed reputations for their wake-up techniques, ranging from gentle shoulder shaking to methods that bordered on medieval alarm clock terrorism. Women faced particular challenges with nocturnal prayer obligations. Pregnant and nursing mothers were technically exempt from some night prayers, but social pressure often meant they participated anyway, leading to exhaustion that probably contributed to high maternal mortality rates. Medieval medical texts describe various ailments that were almost certainly related to chronic sleep deprivation, though they attributed these symptoms to imbalances in the humors rather than recognizing the obvious connection to interrupted sleep. The seasonal variations in daylight hours created additional complications for medieval sleep schedules. In summer, when daylight lasted until late evening, people would stay awake later but still had to wake up for the same nighttime prayer obligations. In winter, when darkness fell early, they'd go to bed earlier but still had to maintain the same fragmented sleep pattern. This created a kind of medieval jet lag that lasted for months at a time, with people constantly adjusting their sleep schedules to accommodate both natural light cycles and religious obligations. Travel presented special challenges for maintaining nocturnal prayer schedules. Pilgrims and merchants on the road couldn't always rely on monastery bells to wake them up, so they developed elaborate timekeeping methods involving candles, water clocks, and sometimes just trained roosters. Some travelers carried portable prayer books with detailed instructions for maintaining proper prayer schedules while away from home, essentially creating medieval travel guides for the spiritually obsessed. The social implications of skipping night prayers were severe. People who consistently slept through the bells were viewed with suspicion and could face accusations of spiritual laziness or even demonic influence. There were documented cases of people being excommunicated for chronic prayer, truancy, though it's unclear whether these people were actually spiritually deficient or just desperately sleep-deprived and making poor life choices. Children were gradually introduced to nocturnal prayer schedules, starting with just 1 or 2 wake-up calls per night and building up to the full medieval sleep disruption experience as they got older. This probably explains why medieval children often seem surprisingly mature in historical accounts. They were operating on adult sleep schedules and developing the kind of sleep-deprived wisdom that comes from contemplating existence at 3 a.m. on a regular basis. You've somehow survived another night of fragmented prayer schedules, and now you're facing a new challenge. Figuring out when exactly you're supposed to sleep based on the season, your social status, and whether you can afford to keep a candle burning past sunset. Welcome to medieval sleep schedules, where bedtime wasn't determined by your personal preference or even basic human circadian rhythms, but by a complex equation involving daylight hours, candle costs, agricultural demands, and social expectations that would make a modern time management consultant weep with frustration. During the long summer days, when daylight stretched from early morning until late evening, you'd find yourself staying awake until what we'd consider ridiculously late hours, not because you were binge-watching medieval Netflix, but because going to bed while the sun was still up was considered both wasteful and slightly suspicious. Medieval people believed in maximizing daylight hours for productive activities, which meant that summer bedtimes could be pushed back to 10 or 11 p.m., an hour that was practically nocturnal by medieval standards, and probably left people feeling like they were living in some kind of perpetual time zone confusion. But here's where medieval logic gets really interesting. They didn't just shift their bedtime later in summer, they also woke up earlier to take advantage of the extended daylight. This created what historians now call seasonal sleep compression, where people got significantly less sleep during summer months, but were expected to maintain the same level of productivity and spiritual devotion. It was like a medieval version of daylight saving time, except instead of just changing your clocks, you fundamentally altered your entire sleep architecture for months at a time. Winter presented the opposite challenge. When darkness fell at 4 or 5 p.m., people faced the prospect of spending 14 hours in darkness with nothing to do but sleep, pray, and contemplate the existential bleakness of medieval existence. But here's the catch. Candles and oil for lamps were expensive, and most people couldn't afford to light their homes throughout the long winter evenings. This created a kind of forced hibernation period where people would go to bed shortly after sunset and wake up well before dawn, essentially living like very religious, very cold bears. The cost of artificial lighting was a major factor in determining sleep schedules. A single candle represented a significant expense for most medieval households, equivalent to several hours of wages for a common laborer. This meant that candlelight was reserved for essential activities like cooking, emergency situations, and the occasional special occasion. Going to bed by candlelight was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford on a regular basis, and it carried social implications that went far beyond simple convenience. Wealthy households developed elaborate seasonal lighting strategies that would make modern energy consultants proud. They'd use expensive beeswax candles in the main living areas, cheaper tallow candles for servants' quarters, and oil lamps for specific tasks that required sustained illumination. Some wealthy families even employed designated candle bearers whose job was to carry light from room to room, essentially creating human flashlights that could be summoned as needed. Agricultural demands created another layer of complexity in medieval sleep schedules. During planting and harvest seasons, people's sleep patterns were completely disrupted by the need to work from dawn until dusk, or sometimes even later. Harvest time was particularly brutal. People would work until they literally couldn't see what they were doing, grab a few hours of sleep, and then wake up before dawn to start all over again. It was like a medieval version of finals week, except instead of cramming for exams, you were cramming an entire year's worth of food production into a few critical weeks. The social implications of sleep scheduling were surprisingly complex. Going to bed too early was seen as lazy, while staying up too late was viewed as wasteful or potentially immoral. There was a narrow window of socially acceptable bedtime that varied by season, social class, and occupation. Merchants and craftsmen were expected to stay up later than farmers, while nobles had more flexibility in their sleep schedules, but also faced more social scrutiny about how they spent their time. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually needed less sleep than we do today, or whether they just developed different expectations about sleep quality and quantity. Some evidence suggests that medieval people were chronically sleep-deprived, especially during summer months when daylight hours were long and social expectations required maximizing productive time. Other research indicates that medieval people may have been more efficient sleepers, able to achieve better rest in shorter periods due to their physically demanding lifestyles and lack of modern distractions. The church played a significant role in regulating sleep schedules, not just through mandatory prayer times, but also through teachings about the moral implications of sleep. Medieval theology viewed excessive sleep as a form of sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins, while insufficient sleep was seen as a failure to maintain the body as a temple of God. This created a kind of spiritual Goldilocks zone where people had to sleep just the right amount to avoid both spiritual and physical consequences. Children's sleep schedules were particularly affected by seasonal variations. During summer, children would often stay awake as late as adults, participating in evening activities and social gatherings that could last until well past modern bedtimes. In winter, children would go to bed with the rest of the family shortly after sunset, creating a kind of family hibernation period that lasted for months. This probably contributed to the strong family bonds that characterized medieval society, since people literally had no choice but to spend long winter evenings together in darkness. The development of mechanical clocks in the later medieval period began to change sleep scheduling practices, though most people still couldn't afford to own timepieces. Public clocks in town squares and church towers provided a more standardized way of measuring time, but people still relied primarily on natural light cycles and seasonal variations to determine their sleep schedules. The transition from natural to mechanical timekeeping was gradual and uneven, creating a period where some people lived by clock time, while others still followed the ancient rhythms of sunrise and sunset. Seasonal affective disorder was probably a significant issue in medieval society, though it wasn't recognized as a medical condition. The combination of shortened daylight hours, disrupted sleep schedules, and limited artificial lighting during winter months likely contributed to widespread depression and mood disorders that were attributed to various other causes. Medieval medical texts describe winter ailments that sound remarkably similar to modern descriptions of seasonal depression, though they attributed these symptoms to imbalances in bodily humors rather than recognizing the connection to light exposure and sleep disruption. You've managed to navigate the complex seasonal sleep schedule, and now you're facing perhaps the most scandalous decision of your medieval evening: what to wear to bed. But here's where things get really spicy. You might not be wearing anything at all, and this choice could literally determine your eternal salvation or damnation, according to medieval moral authorities. Welcome to the great medieval pajama debate, where the question of sleeping naked versus clothed sparked theological arguments that would make modern internet comment sections look like polite philosophical discussions. The controversy over nocturnal nudity divided medieval society into 2 passionate camps: the naked sleepers, who believed that God created the human body to be free and unencumbered during rest, and the clothed sleepers, who were convinced that nighttime nudity was an invitation for demonic possession and moral corruption. This wasn't just a matter of personal preference, it was a lifestyle choice that could get you excommunicated, gossiped about, or worse, labeled as someone with questionable moral fiber and possibly supernatural tendencies. Medieval medical authorities were surprisingly divided on the naked sleep question. Some physicians, following ancient Greek and Roman medical traditions, argued that sleeping without clothes allowed the body's natural humors to circulate freely, preventing illness and promoting healthy sleep. They claimed that tight clothing during sleep could trap harmful vapors and lead to various ailments, from night sweats to more serious conditions that sounded suspiciously like what we'd now recognize as heat, rash, and skin infections. On the other side, medieval moralists were absolutely horrified by the idea of nocturnal nudity. They argued that sleeping naked left the soul vulnerable to demonic attacks, since demons were apparently particularly attracted to unclothed humans during their most defenseless state. Church authorities published treatises warning that naked sleepers were essentially sending out supernatural invitations to evil spirits, turning their bedchambers into demonic nightclubs with very specific dress codes. The practical arguments for naked sleeping were actually quite compelling. Medieval clothing was heavy, scratchy, and often infested with the same fleas and lice that plagued the bedding. Sleeping in your day clothes meant marinating in your own sweat, dirt, and various bodily fluids that had accumulated throughout the day, creating a kind of medieval marinade that was probably more effective at attracting insects than repelling them. Plus, removing clothes for sleep gave people a chance to check for parasites, wounds, and other health issues that might otherwise go unnoticed. But the moral implications of naked sleeping were taken very seriously. Medieval theologians argued that nudity during sleep could lead to impure thoughts, inappropriate touching, even of oneself, and a general loosening of moral constraints that could have devastating consequences for one's spiritual well-being. They recommended sleeping in specially designed sleep garments that covered the body completely while still allowing for some air circulation, essentially creating the medieval equivalent of full-body pajamas that looked like religious habits. The wealthy developed elaborate solutions to the naked sleeping dilemma. They could afford to own separate sleep garments made from finer materials that were more comfortable than day clothes, but still maintained moral propriety. These sleep garments were often made from linen or other softer fabrics, and were designed to be loose-fitting and breathable, while still covering all the potentially problematic body parts that might attract demonic attention or lead to moral corruption. Married couples faced particular challenges with the naked sleeping controversy. Church authorities grudgingly acknowledged that married couples might need to sleep without clothes for legitimate reproductive purposes, but they warned against making naked sleeping a regular habit. Some marriage manuals from the period provide detailed instructions for how married couples should handle nighttime nudity, including specific prayers to recite and positioning guidelines that sound more like military maneuvers than romantic advice. Historians still argue whether the naked sleeping controversy was really about moral concerns or reflected deeper anxieties about sexuality and bodily autonomy in medieval society. Some scholars suggest that the debate was actually a way for church authorities to exercise control over the most private aspects of people's lives, extending religious oversight into the bedroom in ways that would make modern privacy advocates absolutely furious. The gender implications of the naked sleeping debate were particularly complex. Women who slept naked were viewed with much more suspicion than men, since female sexuality was already considered dangerous and potentially corrupting. Medieval texts suggest that naked sleeping by women could lead to everything from infertility to possession by succubi, those female demons who specialized in nighttime seduction and spiritual corruption. Men, on the other hand, were warned mainly about the practical dangers of nighttime nudity, like exposure to cold and increased vulnerability to demonic attack. Climate played a significant role in shaping attitudes toward naked sleeping. In the warmer southern regions of Europe, naked sleeping was more common and generally more accepted, while in the colder northern regions, people were more likely to sleep clothed simply for warmth. This created regional variations in sleeping customs that reflected both practical considerations and cultural attitudes toward the human body and sexuality. The rise of cotton and other softer fabrics in the later medieval period began to change the naked sleeping debate. As more comfortable clothing became available, the practical arguments for naked sleeping became less compelling, while the moral arguments remained just as strong. This led to a gradual shift toward clothed sleeping, though the debate continued to rage in theological circles for centuries. Children were gradually introduced to the naked sleeping controversy as they reached adolescence. Young children were generally allowed to sleep naked or in minimal clothing, since they were considered sexually innocent and therefore not vulnerable to the moral dangers of nudity. But as children reached puberty, parents had to navigate the complex social and religious expectations around appropriate sleep attire, essentially introducing their teenagers to one of medieval society's most contentious lifestyle debates. The practical reality was that most people probably slept in whatever was most comfortable and affordable, regardless of the theological implications. Poor people often had only one set of clothes, so sleeping naked was sometimes the only way to allow their garments to air out and partially clean themselves. Wealthy people had more options but also faced more social scrutiny about their sleeping habits, creating a kind of medieval catch-22 where having choices about sleepwear also meant having more opportunities to make socially unacceptable decisions. You've somehow survived the naked sleeping controversy, and now you're drifting into dreams. But wait, those aren't just random neurological firings creating bizarre nighttime entertainment. According to medieval wisdom, your dreams are actually a thriving marketplace of supernatural information, prophetic visions, and divine messages that could make you rich if you know how to interpret them correctly. Welcome to the medieval dream interpretation industry, where your nighttime anxieties about being chased by a giant turnip could be transformed into a lucrative fortune-telling business that would make modern life coaches jealous. Medieval people took their dreams very seriously, viewing them as direct communications from God, warnings from deceased relatives, or occasionally messages from demons trying to lead them astray. This wasn't just superstition, it was a sophisticated belief system that turned every sleeping person into a potential prophet and every nightmare into a business opportunity. Dream interpretation became one of the most popular forms of medieval entertainment and spiritual guidance, essentially creating the world's first overnight success stories. The dream interpretation business attracted some truly creative entrepreneurs. Professional dream readers would set up shop in markets and town squares, offering to decode the symbolic meaning of your nocturnal visions for a small fee. These medieval dream analysts developed elaborate systems for categorizing different types of dreams and their meanings, creating detailed price lists that varied depending on the complexity and apparent importance of the dream in question. Dreaming about angels was more expensive to interpret than dreaming about farm animals, though both were considered significant enough to warrant professional consultation. Medieval dream interpretation manuals were surprisingly detailed and comprehensive. These texts provided specific meanings for hundreds of different dream symbols, from common animals to abstract concepts like flying or falling. Dreaming about water meant different things depending on whether it was clear or muddy, flowing or still, and whether you were drinking it, swimming in it, or drowning in it. The level of detail in these interpretations was remarkable. They covered everything from the color of objects in dreams to the time of night when the dream occurred. But here's where the medieval dream industry gets really interesting. People didn't just interpret their own dreams, they actively sought out other people's dreams to analyze and profit from. Dream sharing became a popular social activity, with people gathering in taverns and private homes to share their nocturnal visions and debate their meanings. It was like a medieval version of social media, except instead of posting photos of your breakfast, you were sharing detailed accounts of your subconscious anxieties and hoping someone would pay you for the privilege of analyzing them. The church had a complicated relationship with dream interpretation. On one hand, biblical tradition was full of prophetic dreams and divine visions, so dismissing dreams entirely would have been theologically problematic. On the other hand, the dream interpretation industry was attracting charlatans and potentially leading people away from proper religious guidance. Church authorities developed detailed guidelines for distinguishing between legitimate divine dreams and ordinary nocturnal nonsense, though these guidelines were often as confusing as the dreams themselves. Wealthy patrons would sometimes employ full-time dream interpreters, essentially creating medieval dream consultants who lived in their households and were available to analyze any significant nocturnal visions. These professional dream readers developed reputations for accuracy and insight, though their success probably had more to do with their ability to tell wealthy people what they wanted to hear than with any genuine prophetic abilities. The best dream interpreters were essentially medieval therapists who helped people work through their anxieties and fears by reframing them as divine messages. Historians still argue whether medieval dream interpretation was genuinely believed to be supernatural communication or was recognized as a form of entertainment and psychological comfort. Some evidence suggests that people understood the symbolic and metaphorical nature of dream interpretation while still finding it personally meaningful and helpful. Others argue that medieval people literally believed their dreams were direct communications from supernatural beings and treated dream interpretation as a form of religious practice. The seasonal variations in medieval life created interesting patterns in dream interpretation. During winter months, when people slept longer and had more vivid dreams due to extended periods of darkness, the dream interpretation business would boom. Spring and summer brought different types of dreams, often related to agricultural concerns and seasonal activities, creating a kind of agricultural dream calendar that reflected the rhythms of medieval life. Women played a particularly important role in the dream interpretation industry, both as interpreters and as clients. Medieval women were considered more spiritually sensitive and therefore better equipped to understand the symbolic language of dreams. Female dream interpreters often specialized in dreams related to childbirth, family relationships, and domestic concerns, while male interpreters focused more on dreams about war, politics, and business. This gender specialization created a kind of medieval dream interpretation guild system with different areas of expertise. The traveling dream interpreter was a common figure in medieval society, moving from town to town and offering services to people who couldn't afford their own personal dream analyst. These itinerant dream readers developed portable interpretation systems and memorized extensive catalogues of dream symbols and their meanings. They were essentially medieval traveling salespeople, except instead of selling physical goods, they were selling explanations for people's subconscious anxieties and hopes. Children's dreams were considered particularly significant, since children were thought to be more pure and therefore more receptive to divine messages. Parents would often consult dream interpreters about their children's nightmares and unusual dreams, seeking guidance about everything from health concerns to future career prospects. Some medieval texts suggest that parents would even try to influence their children's dreams by telling them specific bedtime stories or exposing them to particular images before sleep. The nightmare interpretation specialty was particularly lucrative, since people were desperate to understand why they were being tormented by frightening dreams. Medieval nightmare interpreters developed elaborate theories about the causes of bad dreams, ranging from dietary issues to spiritual attacks by demons. They offered various remedies for preventing nightmares, from special prayers to be recited before sleep to specific foods that should be avoided at dinner. The connection between physical health and dream content was recognized by medieval interpreters, who often worked closely with physicians to provide holistic care for their clients. Dreams about illness, injury, or death were taken very seriously and could lead to medical consultations and treatments. This created an interesting overlap between medieval medicine and dream interpretation, with some practitioners offering combined services that addressed both physical and spiritual aspects of health. You've been sleeping on straw and enduring nightly visits from your flea roommates for months now, and your neck feels like it's been used as a medieval torture device, which, in a way, it has. But salvation is coming in the form of the most revolutionary sleep technology the medieval world has ever seen: the pillow. Yes, you're about to witness the great pillow revolution, a transformation so dramatic that it would make the invention of the smartphone look like a minor adjustment to daily life. Prepare yourself for the transition from sleeping on what amounts to a wooden brick to experiencing the cloud-like luxury of feathers, though this journey will be filled with more controversy than you'd expect from a simple bedding accessory. For centuries, medieval people had been resting their heads on whatever was available and hard enough to provide support: wooden blocks, stone slabs, bundles of straw, or rolled-up clothing that had probably been worn for weeks without washing. These makeshift pillows were about as comfortable as sleeping on a pile of medieval tax records, and they created neck problems that would make modern chiropractors rich. The wealthy might have access to slightly softer materials like folded cloth or small sacks filled with grain, but even these luxury options were far from what we'd consider comfortable. The introduction of actual feather pillows to medieval Europe was a gradual process that began with returning crusaders who had experienced the exotic comfort of Byzantine and Islamic sleeping arrangements. These battle-hardened warriors came back from the Holy Land with tales of battles, sieges, and incredibly soft things you could rest your head on that didn't require you to wake up with a crick in your neck that lasted for days. The idea of sleeping on bird feathers seemed almost scandalously luxurious to people who were accustomed to treating comfort as a sign of moral weakness. But here's where the pillow revolution gets controversial. Medieval moralists were absolutely horrified by the idea of soft pillows. They viewed comfortable sleeping arrangements as a form of spiritual corruption that could lead to laziness, lustful thoughts, and a general weakening of moral fiber. Church authorities argued that sleeping on hard surfaces was a form of self-mortification that brought people closer to God, while soft pillows were essentially invitations to sin and spiritual decay. The pillow became a symbol of the ongoing medieval struggle between comfort and righteousness. The practical challenges of pillow manufacturing were enormous. Feathers had to be collected, cleaned, and processed, which was a time-consuming and expensive process. The best feathers came from specific types of birds: geese, and ducks were preferred over chickens, while swan feathers were considered the ultimate luxury. Collecting enough feathers for a single pillow could take months, and the process of cleaning and preparing them required specialized knowledge that turned pillow making into a skilled craft. Medieval pillow makers developed elaborate techniques for creating different types of pillows for different purposes. Firm pillows filled with compressed feathers were recommended for people with neck problems, while softer pillows with loosely packed feathers were preferred for general comfort. Some pillows were designed with compartments that could be adjusted to change the firmness, essentially creating the medieval equivalent of customizable sleep systems. The pillow trade became surprisingly international, with different regions developing reputations for producing specific types of pillows. Italian pillow makers were known for their silk covers and exotic feather combinations, while Northern European manufacturers focused on durability and practical designs. This international pillow trade created a kind of medieval luxury goods market that connected sleeping comfort to global commerce in ways that would make modern supply chain managers appreciate the complexity of medieval trade. Networks. Wealthy households began to accumulate large collections of pillows, with different pillows for different occasions and seasons. Summer pillows were filled with lighter materials and covered with breathable fabrics, while winter pillows were denser and designed to provide more insulation. Some wealthy people owned specialized pillows for travel, illness, and even specific sleeping positions, creating personal pillow wardrobes that reflected their social status and sleeping preferences. But the pillow revolution created new problems along with new comforts. Feather pillows were perfect breeding grounds for insects and parasites, creating a whole new category of bedding-related pest problems. The same fleas and lice that plagued straw mattresses found feather pillows to be even more hospitable, since the feathers provided better insulation and more hiding places. Pillow maintenance became a specialized skill, requiring regular cleaning, refluffing, and pest management that was more complex than caring for simpler bedding. Historians still argue whether the introduction of pillows actually improved sleep quality or just created new expectations and anxieties around sleeping comfort. Some evidence suggests that people who transitioned from hard surfaces to soft pillows experienced better sleep and fewer neck problems, while other sources indicate that the adjustment period was difficult and some people actually preferred their old sleeping arrangements. The social implications of pillow ownership were complex and revealing. Having a pillow became a status symbol that demonstrated both wealth and a certain level of moral flexibility regarding comfort and luxury. Pillow covers became opportunities for displaying fine embroidery and expensive fabrics, turning what was essentially a functional item into a form of decorative art that could be shown off to visitors and guests. Children's relationship with pillows was particularly interesting, since young people were generally expected to sleep on harder surfaces to build character and avoid developing soft, lazy habits. The age at which children were allowed to use pillows became a kind of rite of passage, marking the transition from childhood to adulthood and from simple survival to the possibility of comfort and luxury. The pillow revolution also influenced medieval architecture and furniture design. Beds began to be designed with pillow placement in mind, and the development of headboards and other bed accessories reflected the growing importance of comfortable head support. Some medieval beds were built with adjustable features that could accommodate different pillow arrangements, essentially creating the first customizable sleep systems. Medical authorities gradually began to recognize the health benefits of proper pillow support, though they remained cautious about recommending too much comfort. Medieval medical texts describe various ailments that could be prevented or treated with appropriate pillow use, from neck pain to breathing problems. This medical endorsement helped legitimize pillow use and made it more acceptable for people to pursue sleeping comfort without feeling guilty about their moral priorities. The pillow industry created new economic opportunities for everyone from feather collectors to skilled craftspeople who specialized in pillow construction and maintenance. Pillow repair became a recognized trade, with specialists who could refurbish old pillows, replace worn covers, and address the various problems that came with owning these luxury sleep accessories. You've just settled into your new feather pillow, feeling like medieval royalty, when a distinctly unpleasant aroma wafts up from somewhere near your feet. It's not just the usual bouquet of unwashed bodies and flea-infested straw, there's something else mixing into this olfactory nightmare, something that makes you realize your bedroom has become a multi-sensory experience that assaults every sense simultaneously. Welcome to the absolutely revolting world of medieval bedroom hygiene, where the phrase night soil takes on a meaning that will make you grateful for modern plumbing and possibly question every life choice that led humanity to this point. The medieval approach to bedroom waste management was based on a simple principle. If you can't see it, smell it, or step in it, it's probably fine. This philosophy led to some truly creative solutions for dealing with basic human biological needs during the long hours of darkness, when venturing outside was dangerous, impractical, or just really, really cold. The chamber pot became the centerpiece of medieval bedroom furniture, though calling it furniture is generous when describing what was essentially a ceramic bowl designed to contain human waste in the most inconvenient location possible. Chamber pots were strategically placed within arm's reach of sleeping areas, creating a kind of medieval bathroom that was integrated directly into the bedroom in ways that would make modern interior designers weep. These weren't just simple containers, they were elaborate systems that reflected social status, personal wealth, and sometimes a disturbing level of artistic creativity. Wealthy households had chamber pots made from fine ceramics with decorative patterns, while poorer families made do with whatever containers they could find or afford. But here's where medieval waste management gets really interesting. The contents of chamber pots weren't just disposed of, they were considered valuable commodities. Human waste was collected and sold to farmers as fertilizer, tanners for leather processing, and alchemists for various mysterious purposes that probably didn't improve anyone's quality of life. This created a whole economy around what we'd consider the most unpleasant aspect of medieval bedroom life, turning every chamber pot into a small-scale waste processing facility. The logistics of chamber pot maintenance were mind-boggling. Someone had to empty these containers regularly, clean them, and dispose of the contents in ways that didn't create public health disasters. This responsibility usually fell to the lowest-ranking servants, who developed specialized techniques for managing bedroom waste without completely destroying their sense of smell or will to live. The job of night soil removal was considered one of the most unpleasant occupations in medieval society, which is saying something given the general level of unpleasantness in medieval occupations. Medieval bedrooms also had to accommodate other hygiene needs that we'd consider basic, but were revolutionary for their time. Washing facilities were minimal, usually just a basin of water that was shared among multiple people and changed infrequently. The concept of daily bathing was not just impractical, but considered potentially dangerous, since medieval medical theory suggested that frequent washing could weaken the body's natural defenses and lead to illness. The wealthy developed elaborate bedroom hygiene rituals that were more about social status than actual cleanliness. These might include perfumed water for hand washing, scented herbs scattered around the sleeping area, and special clothing that was changed more frequently than the average person's garments. But even these luxury hygiene practices were minimal by modern standards and probably didn't do much to improve the overall aromatic environment of medieval bedrooms. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually became accustomed to these unsanitary conditions, or whether they were constantly aware of and bothered by the smell, filth, and general unpleasantness of their sleeping environments. Some evidence suggests that medieval people had different tolerance levels for odors and unsanitary conditions, while other sources indicate that people were well aware of the problems but lacked practical solutions. The seasonal variations in bedroom hygiene were particularly challenging. During winter months, when windows were kept closed and heating was minimal, bedrooms became sealed environments where odors and moisture accumulated for months at a time. The combination of body heat, unwashed clothing, chamber pot contents, and general lack of ventilation created atmospheric conditions that were probably visible as well as smellable. Women faced particular challenges with bedroom hygiene, especially during menstruation and childbirth. Medieval society had limited understanding of feminine hygiene needs, and the available solutions were crude and often unsanitary. Women developed various personal hygiene strategies using available materials like cloth scraps and natural absorbents, though these solutions were far from adequate and probably contributed to various health problems. The development of soap and other cleaning products began to change bedroom hygiene practices, though these improvements were gradual and uneven. Soap was expensive and not widely available, so most people relied on water alone for cleaning, which was minimally effective at best. The introduction of better cleaning products created new social distinctions between people who could afford proper hygiene supplies and those who couldn't. Children's bedroom hygiene was particularly problematic, since young people were expected to manage their own waste and cleaning needs with minimal supervision or assistance. Medieval texts provide surprisingly detailed instructions for teaching children proper chamber, pot use, and basic hygiene practices, though these instructions were often more aspirational than practical given the limited resources available. The connection between bedroom hygiene and disease was not well understood in medieval times. though people gradually began to recognize that cleaner sleeping environments led to better health outcomes. This recognition led to gradual improvements in bedroom sanitation practices, though these changes were slow and often resisted by people who viewed excessive cleanliness as a sign of vanity or moral weakness. Medieval bedroom hygiene also had to accommodate the needs of sick and elderly people, who often spent extended periods in bed and required special care. The lack of understanding about infection, control, and disease transmission meant that sick rooms were often sources of contamination that spread illness to other household members. The development of better care practices for bedridden patients was gradual and often based more on trial and error than on scientific understanding. The privacy implications of bedroom hygiene were complex, since most people shared sleeping spaces and therefore had to coordinate their hygiene needs with others. The use of chamber pots, washing facilities, and other hygiene-related activities became communal experiences that required social coordination and probably contributed to the general lack of privacy that characterized medieval life. You've managed to survive the aromatic nightmare of medieval bedroom hygiene, and now you're wondering if perhaps a nice herbal tea might help you drift off to sleep despite the overwhelming sensory assault on your nostrils. But wait, that innocent-looking cup of bedtime brew isn't just chamomile and honey. You're about to discover the absolutely terrifying world of medieval sleep remedies, where the cure for insomnia might literally be worse than staying awake forever, and where the phrase, sleeping like a baby, takes on a whole new meaning when the baby has been given a cocktail of crushed beetles, mercury, and substances that are definitely not FDA approved. Medieval people took their sleep problems very seriously, and when I say seriously, I mean they were willing to consume combinations of ingredients that would make a modern poison control center issue immediate evacuation orders. The medieval approach to sleep medicine was based on the principle that if something tasted terrible, smelled worse, and made you question your life choices, it was probably good for you. This philosophy led to the development of sleep remedies that were more like chemistry experiments gone wrong than anything resembling safe medical treatment. The most popular medieval sleep potion was a delightful concoction made from opium poppies, which sounds reasonable until you realize that medieval people had no concept of dosage control or addiction potential. They would brew these poppy-based drinks with the same casual approach they used for making regular tea, except instead of caffeine, they were dealing with a substance that could put you into a coma or kill you if you got the measurements slightly wrong. The fact that people survived these treatments is probably more evidence of divine intervention than medical skill. But opium was just the beginning of the medieval sleep remedy arsenal. Wealthy people could afford exotic ingredients like crushed pearls, which were believed to have cooling properties that promoted peaceful sleep. The theory was that pearls absorbed negative energy and transformed it into positive sleep vibrations, though this was probably just medieval marketing for extremely expensive calcium carbonate. Crushing pearls for sleep medicine was essentially the medieval equivalent of putting diamonds in your morning coffee, financially devastating and medically pointless. Medieval sleep remedies also featured an impressive array of animal-based ingredients that would make modern vegans faint. Powdered unicorn horn was the ultimate luxury sleep aid, though since unicorns were in short supply, most people settled for rhinoceros horn or narwhal tusk, which were marketed as acceptable substitutes. The belief was that these mystical animal parts contained concentrated sleepiness that could be transferred to humans through careful preparation and consumption. The preparation methods for medieval sleep remedies were often as dangerous as the ingredients themselves. Many recipes called for heating various substances over open flames, creating vapors that were supposed to be inhaled for their sleep-inducing properties. This led to people essentially huffing unknown chemical compounds in enclosed spaces, which probably did make them unconscious, though not necessarily in a healthy or reversible way. Historians still argue whether medieval sleep remedies actually worked, or whether people just passed out from the toxic effects of consuming dangerous substances. Some evidence suggests that certain herbal remedies did have genuine sedative properties, while other medieval sleep aids were essentially accidental poisoning with occasionally fortunate outcomes. The line between medicine and attempted suicide was apparently very thin in medieval sleep treatment. The dosage instructions for medieval sleep remedies were charmingly imprecise, using measurements like a pinch of this and a dash of that for substances that could be lethal in slightly larger quantities. Recipe books from the period provide instructions like add crushed mercury until the mixture turns the color of moonlight, or Stir in powdered bat wings until you can no longer smell the roses, which were probably more poetic than practical for achieving consistent results. Women's sleep remedies were particularly complex, since medieval medical theory claimed that female sleep problems were caused by different humoral imbalances than male sleep issues. Women were prescribed special combinations of herbs and animal parts that were supposed to address their unique physiological needs, though these remedies were often more dangerous than the sleep problems they were meant to treat. Pregnant women received especially elaborate sleep treatments that were supposed to benefit both mother and child, though they probably did the opposite. The seasonal variations in sleep remedy ingredients created interesting market dynamics, with certain substances becoming more expensive during their peak effectiveness periods. Spring herbs were considered more potent than winter herbs, while animal parts harvested during specific moon phases were believed to have enhanced sleep-inducing properties. This created a kind of medieval commodity market for sleep medicine ingredients that fluctuated based on astrological and seasonal factors. Children's sleep remedies were theoretically gentler than adult treatments, though gentle is a relative term when dealing with medieval medicine. Children were given smaller doses of the same dangerous substances that adults consumed, along with special ingredients like honey to mask the taste of whatever toxic compounds were being administered. The survival rate for children given medieval sleep remedies was probably lower than for children who just dealt with their sleep problems naturally. The wealthy could afford to employ professional sleep remedy preparers, essentially medieval pharmacists who specialized in creating custom sleep potions based on individual needs and preferences. These specialists developed reputations for their ability to create effective sleep remedies without killing their clients, which was apparently a notable achievement in medieval medicine. The best sleep remedy preparers were highly sought after and commanded premium prices for their expertise. Travel sleep remedies were a specialized category of medieval sleep medicine, designed to help people sleep in unfamiliar and often dangerous locations. These portable sleep aids had to be concentrated and shelf-stable, leading to the development of sleep remedy, concentrates that were probably more potent and dangerous than the regular home-brewed versions. Travelers would carry small vials of these concentrated sleep potions, essentially traveling with personal supplies of medieval knockout drops. The religious implications of sleep remedies were complex, since some church authorities viewed artificial sleep aids as a form of spiritual weakness or potential demonic influence. There were theological debates about whether it was acceptable to use chemical substances to induce sleep, with some religious leaders arguing that natural sleep was a gift from God that shouldn't be artificially manipulated. This led to the development of blessed sleep remedies that were supposed to be spiritually acceptable alternatives to purely secular sleep aids. The connection between sleep remedies and dreams was taken very seriously, since medieval people believed that artificial sleep aids could influence the types of dreams people experienced. Certain sleep remedy ingredients were thought to promote prophetic dreams, while others were believed to prevent nightmares or demonic visitations. This created a market for specialized dream-influencing sleep remedies that were essentially medieval dream programming systems. You've somehow survived the medieval sleep remedy roulette without permanent organ damage, and now you're experiencing what might be the most awkward social situation of your medieval life: bundling. Yes, you're about to discover the practice where unmarried couples would climb into bed together, fully clothed, separated only by a wooden board and their collective commitment to Christian virtue. Welcome to medieval courtship's most bizarre tradition, where the phrase "sleeping together" was meant literally, and where the difference between acceptable romance and scandalous behavior was measured in inches and layers of clothing. Bundling was essentially medieval society's solution to the problem of courtship, in a world where privacy was non-existent, heating was expensive, and young people still needed opportunities to get to know each other before committing to marriages that would determine the rest of their lives. The practice involved potential romantic partners sharing a bed while remaining fully clothed and separated by physical barriers, creating a kind of medieval sleepover that was supposed to be both intimate and chaste at the same time. The logistics of bundling were surprisingly complex and required careful preparation to maintain the delicate balance between romantic opportunity and moral propriety. The couple would be fully dressed in their day clothes, often with additional layers added for extra protection against temptation. A wooden board called a bundling board would be placed down the middle of the bed, creating a physical barrier that was supposed to prevent inappropriate contact while still allowing conversation and emotional intimacy. But here's where bundling gets really interesting. The practice was considered completely acceptable by medieval standards, even encouraged by parents who wanted their children to have opportunities for courtship without the expense and inconvenience of formal chaperone meetings. Parents would actually invite potential suitors to bundle with their daughters, essentially turning their bedrooms into supervised dating venues where young people could spend hours talking, getting to know each other, and presumably falling in love while separated by a piece of wood. The social rules governing bundling were incredibly detailed and varied by region, social class, and family traditions. Some families required the couple to remain on top of the bed covers, while others allowed them to get under the blankets, as long as they stayed on their respective sides of the bundling board. Some bundling arrangements included additional chaperones who would sleep in the same room to ensure proper behavior, essentially creating medieval three-way sleepovers with built-in surveillance systems. The clothing requirements for bundling were elaborate and specifically designed to prevent any possibility of inappropriate contact. Women would often wear special bundling sacks, essentially sleeping bags with arms that covered them from neck to feet and made any physical contact impossible. Men might wear similar garments or additional layers of clothing that served the same protective purpose. The result was couples who were technically sharing a bed, but were more physically separated than they would have been sitting across from each other at a dinner table. Historians still argue whether bundling actually prevented premarital sexual activity or just created more creative approaches to romance and physical intimacy. Some evidence suggests that bundling was surprisingly effective at maintaining chastity, while other sources indicate that determined couples found ways to work around the physical barriers and clothing restrictions. The practice seems to have been based more on social trust and personal honor than on the practical effectiveness of wooden boards and extra clothing. The economic advantages of bundling were significant, particularly for families who couldn't afford to heat multiple rooms or provide separate entertainment spaces for courtship. Bundling allowed families to offer hospitality to potential suitors without the expense of maintaining separate guest quarters or providing elaborate entertainment. It was essentially a cost-effective dating system that maximized romantic opportunities while minimizing household expenses. Women's experiences with bundling were particularly complex, since they were expected to be both welcoming to suitors and vigilant about maintaining their reputations. A woman who was too enthusiastic about bundling might be considered forward or morally questionable, while a woman who was too reserved might be seen as unfriendly or difficult to court. Finding the right balance required social skills that were probably more challenging than any modern dating scenario. The seasonal aspects of bundling made it particularly popular during winter months, when the combination of warmth from shared body heat and the opportunity for extended conversation made it an attractive alternative to other courtship activities. Summer bundling was less common, and probably less comfortable, since the additional clothing and physical closeness would have made the experience uncomfortably warm and potentially less romantic. The religious implications of bundling were surprisingly complex, with different religious authorities taking varying positions on the practice. Some church leaders endorsed bundling as a wholesome alternative to unsupervised courtship, while others were suspicious of any practice that involved unmarried couples sharing a bed, regardless of the precautions taken. This created regional and denominational variations in bundling practices that reflected different approaches to courtship and morality. The age range for bundling typically began in the teenage years and continued until marriage, creating a kind of medieval dating system that could last for several years. Young people would bundle with multiple potential partners over time, gradually narrowing their choices based on compatibility and attraction. It was essentially a medieval version of serial dating, except instead of going to movies or restaurants, couples would spend hours lying in bed together talking about their hopes, dreams, and families. The conversation topics during bundling sessions were apparently quite varied and sophisticated, covering everything from personal beliefs and family histories to practical considerations about marriage and household management. These extended conversations probably gave couples a much deeper understanding of each other than they could have achieved through more formal courtship methods, creating marriages that were based on genuine compatibility rather than just physical attraction or family arrangements. The transition from bundling to marriage was often gradual, with couples who had been bundling for extended periods essentially conducting their courtship entirely in bed. The proposal process might even take place during a bundling session, with couples discussing their future plans while lying side by side under the covers. This created a kind of horizontal courtship system that was both intimate and carefully controlled. The bundling tradition eventually declined as housing conditions improved and other courtship opportunities became more available, though it persisted in some communities well into the modern era. The practice represents a fascinating example of how medieval society managed to create opportunities for romance and intimacy within the constraints of limited resources and strict moral codes. You've just finished a delightful bundling session with your potential spouse, and now you're trying to fall asleep when suddenly you feel a crushing weight on your chest, your breathing becomes labored, and you're completely unable to move. But don't worry, according to medieval wisdom, you're not having a medical emergency. You're simply being visited by a demon who has decided to use your body as a personal wrestling mat. Welcome to the absolutely terrifying world of medieval night terrors, where sleep paralysis was explained by an elaborate supernatural ecosystem of creatures that specialized in nocturnal human torment. Medieval people had developed an entire mythology around nighttime sleep disturbances that would make modern horror movies look like children's bedtime stories. The most famous of these supernatural sleep disruptors was the mare, a demonic creature that would sit on people's chests during sleep, causing the crushing sensation and breathing difficulties that we now recognize as sleep paralysis. The mare wasn't just content with physical torment, it also brought nightmares, hence the modern term that literally means nightmare, though the medieval version was far more terrifying than a bad dream about forgetting to wear pants to work. The incubus and succubus were the celebrity demons of medieval sleep disruption, specializing in nocturnal sexual encounters that were both tempting and spiritually dangerous. These creatures would visit sleeping people and engage in activities that medieval moralists considered the ultimate form of supernatural harassment. The incubus targeted women, while the succubus focused on men, and both were believed to be capable of causing pregnancy, illness, and spiritual corruption through their nighttime visits. But here's where medieval demonology gets really creative. These weren't just random supernatural attacks. Medieval people believed that night terrors and sleep paralysis were caused by specific behaviors and spiritual vulnerabilities that could be addressed through proper preparation and protective measures. People who lived immoral lives, ate too much before bed, or failed to maintain proper spiritual hygiene were considered more susceptible to demonic sleep visitations. The protective measures against night demons were elaborate and often involved turning the bedroom into a kind of spiritual fortress. People would place iron objects under their beds, hang protective amulets from the bed frame, and recite specific prayers before sleep. Some families would keep roosters nearby, since the sound of a rooster crowing was believed to drive away demons and other supernatural creatures. The medieval bedroom became a battlefield between good and evil, with sleep as the prize. Medieval medicine offered surprisingly sophisticated explanations for sleep terrors, though these explanations were filtered through the lens of humoral theory and supernatural beliefs. Physicians believed that night terrors were caused by imbalances in the body's natural humors, which made people more vulnerable to demonic influence. The recommended treatments included dietary changes, bloodletting, and various herbal remedies that were supposed to restore the body's natural balance and reduce supernatural susceptibility. The social implications of experiencing night terrors were complex and often stigmatizing. People who reported frequent demonic visitations were sometimes viewed with suspicion, since these experiences could be interpreted as evidence of spiritual weakness or moral failing. On the other hand, surviving demonic attacks was sometimes seen as a sign of spiritual strength and divine protection, creating a complicated social dynamic around sleep terror experiences. Women's experiences with night terrors were particularly complex, since medieval society was already suspicious of female sexuality and spiritual vulnerability. Women who reported succubus visits were often subject to intense scrutiny and sometimes accused of encouraging demonic attention through improper behavior or inadequate spiritual preparation. The connection between night terrors and female sexuality created additional layers of shame and social control around women's sleep experiences. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually believed in the literal existence of sleep demons, or whether these supernatural explanations were metaphorical ways of describing psychological and physiological phenomena that couldn't otherwise understand. Some evidence suggests that medieval people had a more sophisticated understanding of the difference between literal and symbolic truth than we might expect, while other sources indicate that belief in sleep demons was taken quite literally. The seasonal variations in sleep terror reports created interesting patterns that reflected the rhythms of medieval life. Winter months, when people slept longer and in more confined spaces, showed higher rates of reported demonic visitations. This was probably due to the increased likelihood of sleep paralysis and nightmares in environments with poor air circulation and extended periods of darkness, though medieval people attributed these seasonal patterns to the increased activity of supernatural creatures during the long winter nights. The religious responses to sleep terrors were varied and sometimes contradictory. Some church authorities viewed night terrors as spiritual tests that could strengthen faith and devotion, while others saw them as evidence of demonic influence that required immediate intervention. This led to the development of various religious remedies, from special prayers and blessings to more elaborate exorcism procedures for severe cases. Children's night terrors were particularly concerning to medieval parents, since children were considered more vulnerable to supernatural influence due to their spiritual innocence and lack of protective knowledge. Parents would go to great lengths to protect their children from demonic visitations, including sleeping in the same room, maintaining constant vigilance, and teaching children specific prayers and protective rituals to use when experiencing sleep terrors. The connection between diet and sleep terrors was recognized by medieval physicians, who believed that certain foods could attract demons or make people more susceptible to supernatural attacks. Heavy meals before bed, alcohol consumption, and certain spices were thought to create humoral imbalances that invited demonic attention. This led to the development of pre-sleep dietary guidelines that were designed to minimize supernatural vulnerability. The travel implications of sleep terrors were significant, since people believed that sleeping in unfamiliar locations made them more vulnerable to local demons and supernatural creatures. Travelers would carry protective amulets and engage in elaborate bedtime rituals to ward off foreign demons that might not be familiar with their usual protective measures. Inn accommodations were evaluated not just for comfort and cleanliness, but also for their spiritual safety and demonic activity levels. The community aspects of sleep terror experiences created informal support networks where people would share protective strategies and compare supernatural encounters. These discussions probably served important psychological functions, helping people process traumatic sleep experiences and develop coping mechanisms for dealing with recurring night terrors. The shared nature of these experiences created a kind of medieval support group for sleep terror sufferers. The evolution of sleep terror explanations over time reflected changing attitudes towards supernatural beliefs and scientific understanding. As medical knowledge advanced, the emphasis gradually shifted from purely supernatural explanations to more naturalistic approaches, though the transition was slow and uneven across different regions and social classes. You've survived the demonic wrestling matches and now you're lying in your medieval bed, trying to figure out exactly where you fit in the elaborate social hierarchy that determines not just what you eat and where, but literally where you're allowed to sleep and with whom. Welcome to the Byzantine world of castle sleep hierarchies, where your sleeping position relative to the Lord's chamber could be more important than your actual job description, and where the difference between sleeping near the fire and sleeping near the door could mean the difference between comfort and hypothermia. The medieval castle wasn't just a fortress, it was a carefully orchestrated social ecosystem where every sleeping arrangement reinforced the complex web of relationships, obligations, and status distinctions that held feudal society together. You're about to discover that medieval people didn't just go to bed wherever they felt like it. They participated in a nightly ritual of social positioning that was more complex than a chess game and potentially more dangerous than actual warfare if you got it wrong. The lord of the castle and his immediate family occupied the solar, the most private and secure sleeping quarters, usually located on the upper floors with the best views and the most protection from both enemies and the general noise of castle life. These chambers were the medieval equivalent of executive suites, complete with private fireplaces, glass windows, and furnishings that demonstrated the family's wealth and social position. The lord's sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they were about projecting power and maintaining the social distance necessary for feudal authority. But here's where medieval castle sleeping gets really interesting. Even within the lord's family, there were strict hierarchies about who slept where and with whom. The lord and lady might have separate chambers, depending on their relationship and current political needs. Children were distributed among various sleeping arrangements based on their age, gender, and importance to family succession plans. Older sons might have their own chambers to reflect their future inheritance, while younger children shared spaces or slept with servants. The next tier of castle sleepers included trusted retainers, visiting dignitaries, and high-ranking household officials who earned the privilege of sleeping in smaller chambers or alcoves near the lord's quarters. These were the medieval equivalent of VIP accommodations, offering privacy and comfort while still maintaining appropriate social distance from the lord's family. The allocation of these premium sleeping spaces was a form of medieval currency, used to reward loyalty and demonstrate favor. Knights and men-at-arms had their own sleeping hierarchy within the castle's military structure. Senior knights might have small private chambers or share spaces with other knights of similar rank, while younger knights and squires would sleep in communal areas designated for the military household. The sleeping arrangements reflected not just military rank, but also the complex relationships of feudal obligation and personal loyalty that bound the castle's military community together. The household servants occupied the most complex level of the castle sleep hierarchy, with sleeping arrangements that reflected their specific roles, seniority, and relationships with the lord's family. Personal servants to the lord and lady slept closest to their master's chambers, often on pallets outside the bedroom doors, to be available for immediate service. Kitchen servants slept near the kitchens, stable hands near the stables, and general servants wherever space was available and their duties required. Women's sleeping arrangements in medieval castles were particularly complex, since they had to navigate both social hierarchies and gender-specific considerations. Noble women had their own chambers or shared spaces with other women of similar rank, while female servants were often housed separately from male servants to maintain proper moral boundaries. The ladies' personal attendants occupied a special position in the hierarchy, with sleeping arrangements that reflected their intimate access to the lady's private life. Historians still argue whether these elaborate sleeping hierarchies were primarily about social control or practical necessity, given the limited space and resources of medieval castles. Some evidence suggests that the hierarchies were carefully maintained to reinforce feudal relationships and prevent social disorder, while other sources indicate that sleeping arrangements were more flexible and based on immediate practical needs rather than rigid social rules. The seasonal variations in castle sleeping arrangements created additional complexity, as the allocation of heated spaces became a crucial survival issue during winter months. The warmest sleeping areas were reserved for the most important people, while lower-ranking castle residents had to make do with less comfortable accommodations. This created a kind of thermal hierarchy that paralleled the social hierarchy, with warmth serving as both a privilege and a reward for high status. Children's positions in castle sleep hierarchies were determined by their family relationships and future prospects rather than their current age or personal preferences. Noble children were integrated into the adult hierarchy based on their inheritance expectations, while servants' children occupied the lowest rungs of the sleep hierarchy and might not have designated sleeping spaces at all. The sleeping arrangements served as early education in social position and appropriate behavior. The guest accommodation system in medieval castles was incredibly complex, requiring careful consideration of the visitor's social rank, political importance, and relationship to the lord's family. Important guests might be given chambers that were actually superior to those of some family members, while less important visitors might be housed with servants or in communal spaces. The allocation of guest sleeping arrangements was a form of diplomatic communication that could influence political relationships and future alliances. The security implications of castle sleeping arrangements were significant, since the placement of different groups within the castle reflected concerns about loyalty, potential threats, and defensive needs. Trusted retainers slept in positions where they could respond quickly to threats, while potentially unreliable individuals were housed in areas where they could be monitored or quickly contained if necessary. The castle's sleeping arrangements were essentially a three-dimensional map of trust and suspicion. The enforcement of sleep hierarchies required constant vigilance and occasional disciplinary action when people attempted to sleep above their station or in inappropriate locations. Castle officials were responsible for maintaining proper sleeping arrangements and addressing violations of the social order. This created a kind of medieval bedroom police force that monitored sleeping behavior and enforced social boundaries even during the most private hours of the day. The economic implications of castle sleep hierarchies were substantial, since the allocation of sleeping spaces represented a form of compensation and reward system that supplemented monetary payments. Better sleeping arrangements were used to attract and retain valuable servants and retainers, while the threat of reduced sleeping privileges could be used to discipline inappropriate behavior or disloyalty. The mobility within castle sleep hierarchies was possible but limited, with people occasionally moving up or down the sleeping ladder based on changing circumstances, demonstrated loyalty, or shifts in their usefulness to the lord's household. These changes in sleeping arrangements were closely watched by other castle residents, since they provided important information about changing social relationships and political dynamics within the castle community. You've mastered the complex social dynamics of castle sleeping hierarchies, and now you're facing perhaps the most terrifying challenge of medieval life, trying to get some rest while traveling. You're about to discover that medieval travel accommodations made your flea-infested straw mattress at home look like a 5-star resort, and where the phrase "sleeping rough" takes on meanings that would make modern camping enthusiasts question their life choices. Welcome to the nightmare world of medieval travel sleep, where inn accommodations were basically legalized torture chambers and roadside camping meant sharing your sleeping space with bandits, wild animals, and weather that was actively trying to kill you. Medieval inns were essentially medieval hostels, except instead of backpacking college students sharing stories about their gap years, you were sharing beds with merchants who hadn't bathed in months, pilgrims with mysterious ailments, and travelers whose personal hygiene standards made your own questionable practices look pristine. The concept of a private room was so foreign to medieval innkeepers that asking for one would probably get you accused of being either dangerously antisocial or suspiciously wealthy, both of which could make you a target for robbery or worse. The typical medieval inn bed was designed to accommodate as many paying customers as possible, which meant that booking a bed actually meant purchasing the right to share a sleeping surface with complete strangers who might be carrying diseases, stolen goods, or personal vendettas against people who looked suspiciously like you. These beds were essentially medieval communal sleeping experiments that tested the limits of human tolerance for proximity, body odor, and nocturnal disturbances from people whose sleep habits ranged from mildly annoying to potentially life-threatening. But here's where medieval travel accommodations get really interesting. The bed-sharing arrangements followed their own social hierarchies that were separate from the castle sleep systems you might be familiar with. Wealthy merchants might claim the spots closest to the wall for security and warmth, while poorer travelers were relegated to the outer edges where they served as human shields against both cold drafts and potential intruders. The center of the bed was often considered the premium location, offering maximum warmth and minimum vulnerability to attack. The innkeepers developed elaborate systems for managing their communal sleeping arrangements, including designated bed monitors who were responsible for settling disputes, preventing theft, and occasionally separating travelers who discovered they had incompatible sleeping styles or personal grudges. These medieval sleep referees had to navigate complex social dynamics while maintaining order in environments that were essentially pressure cookers of exhaustion, suspicion, and close physical proximity. Medieval travel sleep was also complicated by the complete absence of anything resembling modern security measures. Travelers had to sleep with their valuables, which meant that every bed became a potential crime scene where people were literally sleeping on top of their life savings while surrounded by strangers who might be assessing their wealth and vulnerability. The phrase, "sleeping with one eye open," wasn't just an expression, it was a survival strategy that could mean the difference between waking up with your belongings or waking up robbed, injured, or worse. The seasonal challenges of travel sleep were particularly brutal, since medieval travelers had to deal with weather conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to potentially fatal. Winter travel meant sleeping in frozen conditions that could cause frostbite, while summer travel brought insects, heat, and the kind of humidity that made sharing close quarters with other sweaty humans an especially unpleasant experience. Spring and fall offered their own challenges, including unpredictable weather and road conditions that could strand travelers in unsuitable sleeping locations. Historians still argue whether medieval travelers actually got any meaningful rest during their journeys, or whether they simply endured extended periods of exhaustion punctuated by brief moments of unconsciousness. Some evidence suggests that experienced travelers developed strategies for sleeping in challenging conditions, while other sources indicate that travel sleep was so poor that people would arrive at their destinations in worse physical condition than when they started their journeys. The gender implications of medieval travel sleep were particularly complex and dangerous. Women travelers faced additional security risks and social challenges that made finding safe sleeping accommodations even more difficult. Female travelers often had to choose between sharing beds with strange men, which was socially scandalous and potentially dangerous, or sleeping alone, which was even more dangerous and sometimes impossible to arrange. Some women traveled disguised as men to avoid these complications, though this created its own set of risks and challenges. The roadside camping alternative to inn accommodations was often even worse than the communal bed sharing, since it involved sleeping outdoors in conditions that were hostile to human survival. Medieval travelers who chose to camp had to deal with wild animals, bandits, weather exposure, and the constant threat of attack by people who specialized in robbing vulnerable travelers. The camping gear available to medieval travelers was minimal and often inadequate for protection against the elements or human threats. The class distinctions in medieval travel sleep were stark and often life-threatening. Wealthy travelers could afford better accommodations, armed guards, and transportation that reduced their exposure to the worst travel sleeping conditions. Poor travelers had to make do with whatever shelter they could find or afford, often resulting in sleeping arrangements that were barely adequate for survival. The quality of travel sleep was directly correlated with social status and financial resources, in ways that could determine whether travelers survived their journeys. The religious aspects of medieval travel sleep were significant, since many travelers were pilgrims whose journeys were considered spiritual tests that included enduring hardships and uncomfortable sleeping conditions. Monastery guest houses offered alternatives to commercial inns, though these accommodations often came with their own requirements for religious observance and behavioral compliance. The spiritual aspects of travel sleep were sometimes viewed as opportunities for spiritual growth through suffering and endurance. The health implications of medieval travel sleep were severe, since the combination of poor accommodations, exposure to disease, and physical exhaustion created conditions that were ideal for spreading illness and reducing travelers' ability to fight off infections. Many travelers returned from journeys with ailments that they had contracted during their travels, often in sleeping accommodations that were breeding grounds for disease and parasites. The economic impact of poor travel sleep was substantial, since travelers who arrived at their destinations exhausted and potentially ill were less effective at conducting business or completing their intended activities. The medieval travel industry gradually developed better accommodations and services in response to these problems, though improvements were slow and uneven across different regions and types of establishments. The social bonds formed during shared travel sleep experiences were often lasting and significant, since enduring difficult sleeping conditions together created relationships that were based on mutual survival and shared hardship. Some medieval travel accounts describe friendships and business partnerships that developed during challenging travel experiences, suggesting that the communal nature of travel sleep had some positive social consequences despite its many drawbacks. You've survived the hazardous world of medieval travel sleep, and now you're back in your familiar flea-infested straw bed, but something feels different tonight. There's a certain stillness in the air, a quality of silence that makes you realize this might be your final sleep. Welcome to the elaborate and surprisingly beautiful world of medieval deathbed rituals, where the transition from life to eternal rest became a carefully orchestrated community event that could last for days, involving vigils, prayers, and sleeping arrangements that made regular medieval bedroom chaos look like a peaceful spa retreat. When medieval people realized they were approaching death, the bedroom transformed from a place of nightly rest into a sacred space where the boundary between earthly sleep and eternal rest became beautifully blurred. The deathbed wasn't just where someone died, it was where they conducted their final business, made peace with their relationships, and prepared their soul for the ultimate journey. This process could take days or even weeks, creating extended periods where the dying person's bedroom became the most important room in the entire household. The medieval approach to death preparation was remarkably sophisticated and emotionally intelligent, recognizing that dying was a process that required time, attention, and community support rather than the quick, often isolated experience that characterizes modern death. Family members, friends, servants, and even casual acquaintances would take turns maintaining vigils around the deathbed, creating a continuous presence that ensured the dying person was never alone during their final transition from earthly sleep to eternal rest. The vigil sleeping arrangements were complex and carefully organized, with different people assigned to different shifts and responsibilities during the extended deathbed period. Some vigil keepers were responsible for maintaining prayers and religious observances, while others focused on physical care and comfort. The bedroom became a carefully choreographed space where multiple people would sleep in shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake and attentive to the dying person's needs. But here's where medieval deathbed practices get really fascinating. The dying person often remained conscious and actively participated in their own death preparation for extended periods. They would conduct final business, dictate wills, offer forgiveness, seek reconciliation, and provide instructions for their funeral and burial. The deathbed became a kind of final boardroom where important decisions were made and relationships were resolved before the final sleep began. The religious aspects of medieval deathbed rituals were elaborate and comforting, involving prayers, last rites, and spiritual preparations that were designed to ease the transition from earthly life to eternal rest. Priests and religious officials would maintain regular attendance at deathbeds, providing spiritual guidance and performing sacraments that were believed to prepare the soul for its final journey. The bedroom became a sacred space where the boundary between earth and heaven seemed particularly thin. Medieval people believed that the manner of death and the quality of deathbed preparation could influence the soul's fate in the afterlife, which made the final sleep arrangements incredibly important. The dying person's bed was often repositioned to face east, toward Jerusalem, and special bedding and religious objects were arranged to create a spiritually appropriate environment for the final transition. The deathbed became a carefully constructed bridge between earthly and eternal rest. The community aspects of medieval deathbed vigils were remarkable, bringing together people from all social classes and relationship types to participate in the final care of the dying person. Servants would sleep alongside family members, neighbors would take shifts with close friends, and even casual acquaintances would contribute to the vigil efforts. The deathbed became a great equalizer, where social hierarchies were temporarily suspended in favor of shared humanity and mutual care. Historians still argue whether medieval deathbed practices were primarily about spiritual preparation or practical necessity in a world where medical care was limited and death was often a prolonged process. Some evidence suggests that the elaborate rituals served important psychological functions for both the dying person and their community, while other sources indicate that the practices were mainly about ensuring proper spiritual preparation for the afterlife. The seasonal variations in deathbed practices reflected the practical challenges of maintaining vigils in different weather conditions. Winter deathbeds required careful attention to heating and ventilation, while summer vigils had to manage heat and the increased risk of disease transmission. The bedroom arrangements had to accommodate both the dying person's comfort and the practical needs of the vigil keepers, who would be spending extended periods in the same space. Women played particularly important roles in medieval deathbed care, often serving as the primary organizers and coordinators of vigil arrangements. Women's experience with childbirth and infant care made them especially skilled at managing the intimate physical care required during the dying process. The deathbed became a space where women's traditional caregiving roles were recognized and valued by the entire community. The economic implications of medieval deathbed vigils were significant, since the extended nature of the process required substantial resources and community support. Families had to provide food, shelter, and care for the vigil keepers, while community members contributed labor and resources to maintain the death watch. The deathbed became a kind of community investment in proper death preparation and mutual support. The children's involvement in medieval deathbed practices was carefully managed, with young people gradually introduced to the realities of death through participation in vigils and funeral preparations. Children would often sleep in the same room as dying relatives, learning about death as a natural part of life, rather than something to be feared or avoided. The deathbed became an educational experience that prepared children for their own future encounters with mortality. The final moments of medieval death were often marked by specific rituals and observations that were believed to influence the soul's transition to eternal rest. Family members would watch for signs that the soul was departing, including changes in breathing, facial expressions, and physical appearance. The actual moment of death was often followed by immediate prayers and rituals designed to assist the soul's journey to the afterlife. The transition from deathbed to funeral preparation was carefully managed, with specific protocols for handling the body and transforming the bedroom from a place of dying to a space for mourning and remembrance. The bed where the person had died would often be preserved for a period of time, serving as a focal point for continued prayers and memorial activities. Now, as you lie in your medieval bed tonight, surrounded by the familiar sounds of snoring, scurrying creatures, and the distant toll of monastery bells, you might find yourself feeling strangely grateful for this chaotic, uncomfortable, utterly bizarre sleeping experience. You've survived the fleas and the chamber pots, the bundling boards and the demon attacks, the sleep hierarchies and the travel nightmares. You've discovered that medieval people approach sleep not as a simple biological necessity, but as a complex social, spiritual, and survival challenge that required creativity, endurance, and a sense of humor about the absurdities of human existence. The medieval approach to sleep reveals something profound about human adaptability and the ways we create meaning and community even in the most challenging circumstances. These people managed to find rest, romance, spiritual connection, and social bonds in sleeping conditions that would make modern people call for immediate evacuation. They turned their bedrooms into ecosystems, their sleep schedules into spiritual practices, and their final rest into community celebrations of life and death. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the soft comfort of your modern bed, the clean sheets, the absence of uninvited creatures sharing your space. The medieval world of sleep fades into history, leaving behind only the universal human need for rest and the quiet satisfaction of another day completed. The bells that once shattered medieval nights are now just distant memories, replaced by the gentle sounds of your own peaceful evening. Your eyelids grow heavy, your thoughts become dreamlike, and you slip easily into the kind of uninterrupted, comfortable sleep that would have seemed miraculous to our medieval ancestors. Sweet dreams, knowing that your biggest bedtime worry is probably just whether you remembered to set your alarm. Close your eyes and rest well in your wonderfully boring, beautifully private, completely pest-free modern bedroom.